now to properly welcome you to what is the third research seminar of 2023, which is co-organized with Rikst Woodstra, who you will hear from shortly. We chose architecture as the theme of the series, really as a way to think about the porous boundaries between the arts and the landscapes and spaces that we inhabit. So we're calling it Summer of Architecture 2023. So the series, as you know, showcases new research and approaches to architecture and its histories, but the hope really is to create conversations that allow us to think expansively both about art and about architecture. We will cover a range of different topics over the next few sessions. We've had a few sessions already, so I encourage you to look at the program, come back. All events are posted online as well for viewing and note-taking later. So without further ado, Rikst.
Thank you, Sriya. So it is a pleasure to welcome everyone here for the third event of the Architecture Summer Series. As Sriya said, there are 5 lectures in which we aim to highlight new and also interdisciplinary research and scholarship in British architectural history in the broadest sense. Last week, we heard from Professor Jatwi Chang about climate change, air conditioning, and architecture in Singapore. This week, we'll continue with a subject that's slightly closer to home, but no less interdisciplinary. Today's lecture, which is titled Landscapes of Waste, explores how Britain's landscapes were transformed through the expansion of the coal industry in the 20th century. And our speaker today, Moa Carlsson, will discuss how the enormous amount of waste produced during coal mining in the past decades has left its marks on the national landscape. I think you mentioned it was about 6 billion tons, which is something that can be seen and studied through aerial photography, as she will show us tonight. And I've also mentioned, or I have to mention here, that this is part of a broader book project which is titled Scenic Calculations, Landscape, Industry and Planning in 20th Century Britain, which explores how Britain's landscapes were altered through the coal industry, but also through electricity and oil industries. It's just under contract, Moa said, so I hope it will come out soon because it sounds really fascinating. So Dr. Carlsson is an architect, historian and lecturer at the Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. She's specialized in the history of technology, landscape and urban planning in 20th century Britain and has published widely on the intersection of the history of computing, landscape and planning. Before coming to Edinburgh, she completed her PhD in architecture at MIT and taught architecture studios and seminars at the Bartlett, the AA here close by, Boston Architectural College, and worked professionally in architecture and landscape architecture in London, New York, and Vienna. And finally, I'd like to mention that she's also currently part of a project at the Canadian Centre for Architecture titled The Digital Now, in which she looks at the gendered histories of planning in 1950s and 60s Britain. Moa's lecture will be followed by a short response from Otto Saumarez Smith. He's currently an assistant professor in architectural history at the University of Warwick. He also chairs the 20th Century Society's Casework Committee. He's written widely about modern architecture in cities, particularly in post-war Britain, and quite recently was the recipient of a mid-career fellowship here at the Paul Mellon Centre. His latest book is Boom Cities, Architects, Planners and the Politics of Radical Redevelopment in 1960s Britain, which explored the transformation of city centres across Britain in the 1960s. Moa, the floor is yours.
Oops. So thank you so much for coming, everyone that's in the room, and also those who are online on Zoom. And before I start, I just want to thank Rikst and Sriya for inviting me to present, and also Ella, Kathleen, Tim, and others at the Paul Mellon Center for making this possible. And I have been really looking forward to presenting this paper here in this audience. And I'm really grateful to Otto for taking on the role as kind of discussant or kind of chair of this session, I suppose. So in this presentation, I will be talking about links between coal mining and urban development in 1950s Britain. And a lot has been written about the coal industry in Britain, we know that, about collieries, about mining communities, about how coal transformed our cities, the national economy, and everyday life in different ways. And most of these accounts really foreground coal as this powerful and incredibly useful resource, and they demonstrate how critical it was to the development of the modern state and to modern life. And some of the recent accounts that we might think of would be works such as Gary Boyd's recent Architecture in the Face of Coal, which came out only last year. There's also work being done at the University of Chicago by someone like Alexander Bierig, who is working on a history of the London Coal Exchange. And up in the Scottish context, where I'm based, we have Ewan Gibbs, who recently published a book called Coal Country, The Meaning and Memory of Deindustrialization in Post-War Scotland. And there's a lot more scholarship that we can point to, such as the 5-volume The History of the British Coal Industry that was published in the first half of the 1990s. And on the question of kind of coal or maybe more derelict land, and more generally, we have the powerful polemic Derelict Britain, published by John Barr in 1969. But the way I see it, there's a certain kind of untold history of coal that hasn't really been fully researched yet. And it doesn't concern really the impact of using coal as fuel, but rather the urban consequences of the huge amount of waste that was generated in the process of extracting coal from the ground. The way that this waste was handled and disposed of, it links into urban developments in really interesting and peculiar ways that, the way I see it, and to my knowledge at least, haven't really been fully appreciated yet. So as Rick's mentioned, what I'm going to share here today is part of my book project that I'm just working to complete, which is titled Scenic Calculations. And in this book, I really trace how the national landscape here across Great Britain, but also the perceptions and the understanding and feelings about that landscape changed and were transformed with the expansion of the coal, electricity, and oil industries. And in my book, I analyze a number of kind of significant industrial schemes, all the way from Dungeness up to Orkney and Shetland. And in these accounts, I trace the important role of landscape architects, but also, as Rick mentioned, of these statistical and later computerized and mathematical methods of planning in that process. So one of the chapters in my book is about the Welsh village of Aberfan. And it traces what happened to that village and to the entire kind of valley around it after that tragic disaster in October of 1966. And this, as most of you probably know or perhaps remember, was when a spoil heap that was located on the slope just above the village slipped and came down on the village. And I will say more about that later on. But before we get to that, what do we mean when we say coal spoil or colliery waste? Coal spoil is essentially the debris, so the waste material that is removed when you mine coal. And it's material that doesn't have enough coal content for commercial processing. So it's really a mix of different kinds of material. So how much coal spoilery, how much such waste was there? What is this, the kind of the quantities of this substance that I'm talking about? Between 1913 and 1983, according to the records of the National Coal Board, more than 14 billion metric tons of coal were mined in the United Kingdom. And it's worth remembering that for every ton of matter that was brought to the surface, about a third of that was this waste that had to be disposed of somehow. So in my project, and in what I'm going to present here tonight, I'm really addressing what happened to that more than 6.5 billion tons of colliery waste that was generated during that period. Where did it end up? And here we can see a list of some of the spoil heaps that were recorded by the Coal Board in 1955, but we know subsequently that there was a lot more than these. So the colliery spoil really generated a particular kind of dereliction, one might say. But it also did a lot more than that, and that's some of the things that I will talk about here. But in summary, we can say that the National Coal Board deployed 3 kind of general strategies for disposing of this waste material. And each of these strategies had pretty significant consequences for how post-war Britain developed in particular places and areas. And I call these strategies lost, stashed, and piled. And I will present them in that order, although they fully kind of overlap during the period that I'm talking about. I'll go through the first 2 a bit more quickly, and then discuss the last one, the piles, in a bit more detail. So first, colliery spoil was lost, which meant that it was done away with, quite literally. And here's one example of that. In County Durham, coal spoil from collieries that were located on the coast was dumped straight into the sea using these aerial ropeways. And starting already in the 19th century, just under 3 million tons of such waste was dumped onto the beaches every year. And when coming in from a certain direction, the waves and the wind would push the coal, which some of it was sort of floated on the surface, back onto the beaches, turning them completely black. And this would result often, there are many kind of first-hand accounts, recollections of this, in a layer maybe 3 or 4 foot thick of this black waste material along this coastline. And in places where the stuff kind of piled up, there would be deposits as thick as 30 feet along the County Durham coastline. But coal being a valuable kind of substance, this buildup of the kind of sea coal led to a sub-industry among people that gathered and collected coal along these beaches. And this has been really beautifully documented by documentary photographers such as Chris Killip. You can see a picture of his book there on the right, and also by someone like Mark Pinder. This is a picture from Easington Beach, which I will come back to later. And I should say also that this stretch of coastline was eventually cleaned up with the Project Neptune project of the National Trust. But the concept of lost, colliery spoil being lost, typically meant something else. It meant that you essentially spread it out to be absorbed in agricultural areas. First, you would remove the top layer of soil, the topsoil. You would scrape that off. Then you would spread out the coal spoil across the fields, across the areas. And finally, you would reapply and spread out the topsoil again on top of the spoil. And this typically provided sufficient kind of ground kind of soil substrate to plant grass. And this would then result in areas that could be used for grazing animals and pasture. But there was a kind of growing critique of these projects because it created grazing at quite a high cost, and was it really worth kind of spending that money on land that would essentially just be used in this way? The second strategy used by the National Coal Board to dispose of colliery waste was stashing it away in large infrastructural projects. As Britain entered the 1960s, a situation had developed where large urban and infrastructural projects were initiated that required a huge amount of fill material. And these would be things like motorways, new towns, and other large building projects. We can think of bridges, for example. In 1968, for example, the Ministry of Transport contracts required 14.5 million tons of fill material. So there was really a huge demand for this kind of fill. So it really seemed to many like a match made in heaven, especially as using up the coal spoil would help the project of doing away with derelict or scarred land. So first, we have the motorways. The Preston bypass was opened by Prime Minister Harold Macmillan in December of 1958. Because the subsoil of this area was generally kind of weak, as a weak clay, a subbase along the whole path was laid down, and the chosen material for this subbase was colliery waste. And this subbase had a thickness of around 16 or so inches, and it was laid down along the full stretch of the route. So a total of just under 300,000 tons of waste was stashed away under this particular motorway. And then around 1961, so 3 or so years later, in preparation for the construction of the M4, which runs from West London to the southwest of Wales, the Department of Environment sought to actually establish sites for tipping colliery spoil near the proposed route of the new motorway. So essentially thinking ahead, bringing the colliery waste where it would later be needed. And here we have situations where the local landowners took advantage of this situation, some of them earning up to £5,000 per acre to make the land available for tipping. But there were, of course, important risks with using this colliery waste material. Because it contained a certain percentage of coal, there was a risk of spontaneous combustion of the unburnt or partly burnt waste. And once the colliery spoil heap or deposit started to burn, it was almost impossible to put it out. And it could go on burning for up to 3 or 4 decades. And in addition to that, there was also great variability, of course, within the material in terms of what its constituent materials were, between different parts of a heap and between different heaps. And that, of course, made the mechanical properties vary significantly across different heaps. And both of these problems led to kind of subsidence problems in the motorways that later had to be dealt with. In 1966, so a few years later, a stretch of the M62 motorway, which runs across the West Riding, just south of Leeds. Here a list and a map was drawn up of the collieries near to the proposed route from where such spoil waste material could be fetched. And here the material was mostly used in embankments, which were needed across this predominantly flat Yorkshire landscape. So there was quite a lot of collieries and heaps to choose from. And the local council was, of course, fully on board with this strategy, partly because it would ease the amount of rehabilitation works needed for these derelict tips. It would help them do away with the dereliction. The West Riding County Council even offered to pay the contractor for the difference between using the colliery waste versus buying in the bulk filling from other sources. And this question of joint contracts, so between sourcing road fill and between reclaiming kind of spoil heaps, was considered by the Northwest Road Construction Unit of the Ministry of Transport, specifically in the Lancashire region. In 1971, 750,000 tons of colliery waste from NCB-owned tips was used as fill for the Lancashire-Yorkshire M62 motorway. This was the first time that colliery waste was actively encouraged in the tender documents, a move that was, of course, welcomed by the NCB and its chairman, Derek Esra, who had put a high premium on the product once he realized it was something that one could sell. So just some statistics. In 1967, the National Coal Board sold around 7 million tons of colliery waste, primarily for road constructions, so quite a significant sum. 200,000 tons were also sold for brick making, particularly in Scotland and South Wales, and around 60,000 tons were sold to cement manufacture. So these are some additional ways that this kind of spoil waste material found its way into our built environment. But in many cases, what limited the use of colliery spoil was the cost of transporting it. After all, it was a very heavy product. And in the end, it was up to the contractors to decide what fill material they wanted to use and pay for. Another option discussed was to actually align the motorway routes so as to bring them closer to the areas where fill was most abundant. But this was quickly dismissed by the Department of the Environment because clearing the dereliction wasn't their top priority. Colliery waste was also used as hardcore in building construction. From the 1950s, it was used extensively in urban developments near these coal fields, where there was a surplus of this kind of waste or fill material. And we know that spoil from collieries and waste heaps, slag heaps, was included in the constructions of hundreds and thousands of domestic properties in Britain between 1945 and 1970, particularly as support under concrete floors. And some of the examples that I've looked at are in Gateshead, you can see here, Ashton, which is near Wigan, near the Wigan Alps, and also Peterlee, a new town in County Durham, which is really just a few 100 yards from the Easington beach. And I'm going to show you quickly a video of the Peterlee new town, so we can think about where that coal waste kind of ended up.
It all began in 1882, when the ladies wore bustles and things were...
That's the wrong place. Excuse me. Here we go. That better?
This is Peterlee, a new town in County Durham. A large proportion of its population are miners. The Master of Painting at Durham University was appointed to collaborate with 2 architects of the corporation's staff. Together, they have produced Homes of the Future. The old mining villages of the area are still there, and at first there was opposition to the new project. But now the slogans are wearing off the walls, and men like Mr. Bell, a banksman at Horden Colliery, wish they'd been able to move there long ago. He has his name down for a house. His son, Alan, already lives in the new town. His 2-story house is up-to-date and labor-saving. Like his father, he enjoys gardening. He's a deputy, also at Horden Colliery. Mother-in-law, Mrs. Charlton, finds the kitchen just what she always wanted. When Peterlee was started in 1948, its general design was uninspired. It was just another new town. 7 years later, plans were altered, and the change began in the southwest area where the Bells now live. There's accommodation in Peterlee for the older people. Mr. Walker there spent 51 years in mining. And for the younger generation, Easington Technical College is being built in Peterlee. Yes, with its open effect, modern housing and ideal position with sea on one side and pleasant country on the other, Peterlee points the way to future living conditions in the mining areas.
But before long, a whole new problem emerged with these newer homes built with the use of colliery spoil, sulfate attack on concrete. Sulfate attack on concrete ground floor slabs turned out to be a really serious problem. Once the sulfates, which are in the colliery waste, come in contact with the concrete, a reaction starts, and this produces crystals, which forces the concrete to kind of expand and heave, and this causes crack in the concrete slab. The slab also starts to disintegrate, weakening it and reducing its ability to support the built structure. And the areas where the developments have suffered most badly from these kinds of problems are, of course, the developments where the waste was most plentiful. So there's a direct kind of correlation there between these different histories. In the 1960s, we start using a damp-proofing membrane, which for the architects is essentially that plastic sheet that you put under the concrete to separate the fill from the slab. But probably the most kind of well-known strategy for disposing of this waste product used by the National Coal Board was to dump it in areas that were as easy for them to access and cost-effective for them to use as possible. And this resulted in these huge conical heaps, sometimes reaching a height of over 45 meters, stretching out along roads and other areas for several miles sometimes. And here we can see a picture of these spoil heaps near Wigan, colloquially called the Black Alps or the Wigan Alps. And I'm going to show you another film. And I think we can have a whole conversation possibly about just these films, which are kind of amazing in their own way, I think. So as these spoil heaps grew larger and larger, life, of course, continued among them and next to them. Here is a film produced by the National Coal Board Film Unit, demonstrating the allegedly happy community in Flimby, Cumbria, who have gathered for a rugby game in the shadow of this enormous spoil heap. And this is a film from 1948. And the Coal Board generated quite a number of these films. The one from Peterlee was another example to kind of demonstrate that their activities really weren't that detrimental. Just kind of some amazing imagery there. It's important also to note that these spoil heaps, even the very largest ones, such as the one we can see here, very rarely came under planning control, which of course would have meant that there would have been proper restorations condition imposed on them in terms of what would happen to them. So instead of treating them as land, they were treated as chattels, a term that means a tangible personal property that is movable between locations, so indicating essentially that they weren't permanent. They were just used or landed temporarily in their locations. So even in situations and contacts where these spoil heaps stretched out for miles across the landscape, until the Aberfan disaster, there was no real kind of planning control as to where they would go, where they would grow in the landscape. But already in the 1940s and 50s, there was a growing concern about the ruinous effect of these spoil heaps on rural Britain, which conservationists and others saw as gobbling up Britain's valuable countryside. The exception, of course, was the architectural critic Ian Nairn, who thought these spoil heaps were absolute marvels and that we must be protected and cherished. The response to these kinds of critiques and this kind of concern was largely at first to improve the appearance of the heaps by planting and afforestation. And there was a large research project started at the University of York, for example, which looked into how to best establish young saplings onto the spoil heaps. One idea behind that project was to essentially make the area occupied by the spoil heaps into real estate that would benefit the Forestry Commission. Perhaps they could grow pine and spruce on the heaps for kind of benefit, commercial gain. But we know, of course, that these different strategies, so stashing the spoil away in an infrastructural project or planting them and improving the appearance of these heaps, were not always so clean-cut. In West Riding, for example, the appearance of the spoil heaps were improved simply because they were in view from the new motorways being built, under which the coal spoil was stashed. So in 1957, when the National Coal Board was actively developing this new market for their waste product, the community in the Rhondda Valley in South Wales protested against the National Coal Board, who had started to sell off material from the slag heap on their doorstep. They were selling it again for road ballast. This particular heap had been planted with trees already in the middle of the 19th century by coal mine owner Richard Fothergill. And he was planting the heaps because it had suddenly become visible from his private deer park, which was just located nearby. In 1957, when this kind of protest, when the NCB started selling off the coal slag, the elm trees, sycamore, and the silver birches were more than 100 years old. They were between 50 and 70 meters tall. So removing this spoil material essentially led to the demolition of this kind of treasured landscape that had grown up on top of them. So there are lots of interesting kind of strands, I think, colliding in these projects. On the right-hand side, we see a coal heap near Wrexham in North Wales, where the colliery had closed in 1986. It led just after the miners' strike. It led to the loss of 300 jobs, minor jobs. In 2008, the CADV, so the Historic Environment Service for the Scottish government, opposed a proposal to remove this heap, arguing that removing this tip would have an adverse impact on the historic landscape, not just of the area, but of Wales more generally. So again, it sort of had become part of the industrial heritage of Wales, they argued. Local resident Vera Davies, who lives close to this tip, was outraged, and she responded in the newspaper, "How can that heap of rubbish be seen as a site of historical interest? I understand that coal mining is important in Wales' history, but keeping a slag heap is just ridiculous. Whatever will they think to do next?" And ultimately, again, because of the financial gains of selling off the material, the removal of this heap was granted in 2010 by an appeal by the Welsh government. But more generally, we can see that the attitude and the acceptance of these spoil heaps changed dramatically after the disaster at the Myrtle Vale colliery near Aberfan. So let's look in a bit more detail into what happened there. And again, this is an episode that I go into in more detail in my book. So let's look at the third video quickly. Let's see. So in this video, which is also from the 1940s, you will shortly see the aerial ropeway that brings colliery waste from the colliery, which is located down in the village of Aberfan, up to the spoil heaps above on the hillside. And it's quite an operation, and it's quite a tall structure. And there was a complaint at some point that children were riding on these ropeways, and that the NCB had to kind of secure it better in terms of that access. But what we can see in this video is this kind of technology and how the of creating these spoil heaps. And if you're familiar with the area, you'll recognize the profiles of the tips. So essentially, cart by cart, this material is just dumped onto the heaps in this way. And tracing the growth of these spoil heaps over time is something that we can also do in aerial photographs, as Rix mentioned in her introduction. And this is something that I'm also grown kind of increasingly interested in, how we can use these extensive aerial photography records for urban history and rural history research. So here, for example, we can see a sequence of images from 1945 until 1963 of this particular set of spoil heaps, how they grew, and how also what we can see, it's not quite in view on this particular sortie, but we can see how the town grew alongside of the tips and how they both developed in tandem. So back to that morning of October 26, 1966. At 9:15 in the morning, spoil heap number 7, which was located in the middle of the spoil heaps, gave way and started to slide down towards the village that was located about 150 meters below. As it went, it hit a school and a number of farmhouses and other buildings, resulting in the death of 144 people. And most of those who died in this tragic accident were the children of the miners who worked at the colliery that produced these tips. And I think you can't really mention this history without referring to that wonderful book, Aberfan, Government and Disaster, by Ian McLean and Martin Jones. It's a really great, wonderful read if you haven't read it before. It was published in 2000 by the Welsh Academic Press. And I would say it's really the kind of authoritative account of this, what happened in Aberfan. But here we can see some more kind of powerful images of the aftermath of this disaster. So the reason for the slip was that the spoil heaps were located above a spring. There was a spring coming down the mountainside underneath where the spoil heaps were building up. And this eventually liquefied the spoil heap to the degree that it started to move, and this is what caused the slip. And of course, there was a very substantial and lengthy inquiry after this accident, and the National Coal Board argued that they had no idea about this spring. They didn't know it was there, but of course, everyone in the village knew that it was there, and it's also clearly visible on the OS maps of the area. For hundreds of years, it had been there. But anyway, 6 or so months after the disaster, the National Coal Board employed landscape architect Clifford Tandy and his newly formed firm, the Land Use Consultants, to re-landscape the area after the disaster. Something had to be done, of course, to the landscape after the Coal Board had made the remaining tips safe again. So Clifford Tandy started to develop a number of proposals. The first idea was to simply spread out this coal spoil that remained in the village across the landscape and then dress that with some topsoil and to grass it over. The idea was also to shave off the tips of the remaining spoil heap. So we can see that on the images on the left-hand side here, basically changing the profile of the tips. But at this time, a very heated debate had broken out about who should pay for this work, this remediation work, and the removal of the waste. And this is the process, the political debates around this question of cost that's really well discussed in the book I just mentioned. Leaving the spoil in the village and spreading it out was simply not an option, and there was such a strong opposition to that from the local interest group. And therefore, Tandy went back to the drawing board and drew up a new set of schemes. They were exploring transporting the spoil away, either by road or by using lorries or by rail to other locations. But both of these options were seen as too expensive, especially as the National Coal Board had refused to pay for this operation. So in the end, they settled for a scheme that involved moving the spoil to a position out of sight from the village, essentially shifting it up to a plateau that was located higher up in the hills. So here we can see some images of the final scheme that they kind of decided on. And they built a conveyor belt, and it took more than 3 years to shift the 3.5 million tons of waste that had come down into the village up again onto the mountain, and then terrace it this way that Tandy had planned using his drawings and models. So with this project, the land use consultants, especially Clifford Tandy, who as the lead architect, had really proved their kind of competence in planning and landscaping with the Aberfan remediation project. So the National Coal Board kept employing them to work in other areas where derelict land needed to be treated. And for Tandy, this colliery waste provided a unique opportunity for landscape design on an enormous scale. And as you can see here, he started developing these different techniques and really studying how earth-moving equipment and bulldozers, etc., could be used to kind of shape and create with this waste material. And there was a certain kind of resonance at this time with the earlier period of the 18th century, the landscape gardens and work of someone like Capability Brown, who created these kind of views across the landscape, created new lakes and landforms, etc. But simultaneously, and especially after the disaster of 1966, the Department of Environment started to release a growing fund for remediating derelict land. And there was a general trend after Aberfan that spoil was not really seen any longer as an inevitable part of living in a mining area. People were demanding kind of change and improvement of those areas. And this led to a large number of remediation schemes, which eventually turned many of these kind of derelict areas into recreational ones. So in 1973, for example, the derelict land unit that had been set up in Wales recorded 1731 different schemes of landscape remediation around derelict coal landscapes. And just a few years earlier, before Aberfan, I think they just processed something like 17 projects that year. So it was an enormous growth in these kinds of projects. So Clifford Tandy moved on, and the land use consultants became increasingly busy with this type of work. And one of the most extensive schemes that was undertaken was that in Stoke-on-Trent, which is another project that I discuss in the book. And Otto has also done some really interesting work on Stoke, and I know that this will be published also very soon. So we should all read that too. In Lancashire, which was home to one of the most prolific coal fields in England that was dipped into by more than 1,000 collieries. The Wigan Alps also met such a remediation phase in the mid-1960s. Then the area was transformed into what's now the Three Sisters recreational area, including what is now the Three Sisters racing track, which you can see on the left-hand side here. The picture on the right is not actually a spoil heap, but it's such a lovely picture of a kind of one of these remediation schemes from Beckham and this dry ski slope that was created there. But the vast majority of Britain's tips, with the exception of course, some greening and kind of growth that's happened on them, they remain largely as they were when spoil tipping ceased. And I will end by just bringing us back to the present day and the situation that we're in currently and how these histories may in some ways relate to that. Due to climate change, many historic deposits, especially those in South Wales, are now posing growing and significant threats to their local communities. Increase in rainfall, for example, increases the risk of landslides of spoil tips that are located on sloping ground, which is exactly what happened in Aberfan. In February of 2020, so only a few years ago, such a landslip occurred in Tylerstown as the area was hit by 3 storms in a quick succession. Storm Dennis hit and caused 60,000 tons of coil spoil to slip down the hillside, covering a cycle path, and it also blocked the river valley with several meters of thick colliery spoil. And this triggered the UK Coal Authority to undertake an emergency review of all the spoil tips in Wales, and it turned out that it's more than 2,500 of them. When the National Coal Board was privatised and became British Coal in 1987, as a result, most of the old spoil tips throughout Britain ended up either in local authority or private ownership. And today, the tip safety, for example, here in Wales, is a devolved issue that has fallen to Wales to deal with, and then as a consequence, also to pay for. And the laws that relate to these spoiled tips and how they're maintained and monitored is still the Mines and Quarries Act of 1969, so the act that was developed after the Aberfan disaster. And while this act, of course, made an enormous difference to how these landscapes are maintained, it still lacks a kind of holistic or comprehensive program for how to deal and maintain these heaps. And it lacks power. It doesn't give authorities any power to intervene, except in the circumstance where there's been an accident or an emergency. So kind of just you respond as it's happening as opposed to before, I guess. But the survey that was started in 2020, first of all, involved establishing the ownerships of these heaps. There's, I said, more than 2,500 of them, but it wasn't clear exactly who owned them. Because the National Coal Board had really not kept an extensive or comprehensive record of where this waste had been dumped. Most of it is on private land, with around 40% of them in public ownership. And of these 2,500 tips, about 295 are since 2021 categorized as high risk, which means that they might endanger life or property. 72 spoil heaps in South Wales are further located on sloping ground just above villages or towns. Some of the tips have weather stations or monitoring boreholes, with the really ones with the highest risk. And the highest risk ones have been installed with monitors, movement sensors that can be remotely monitored. And if a substantial or sufficient movement is detected within any of these heaps, this will now trigger an alarm system, which could lead to things like evacuating the villages, etc. So the situation, I think, is really quite serious, and it relates to these histories, I think, directly in really interesting and political ways. So just to conclude, I think I probably ran over, but in this project, I'm really hoping to chart the history of this abundant resource and its effect on the urban geography of Britain. I will explore, and my project explores, how different policies and departments of the British state collaborated and negotiated and attempted to create mutual benefits from this quite dire situation. And I think focusing on these colliery spoil heaps and the waste, coal waste more generally, can also provide a sort of new lens, I think, to view these urban large-scale projects in a new light. And I'm hoping that by doing so, we can also start to link environmental history and urban history, perhaps architectural history also, closer together. So thank you so much for coming to listen.
Oh, I get a kick out of that. That's marvellous. Thank you, Moa. Absolutely wonderful paper. I want to talk about when I first became involved with these sort of issues, or sort of aware of them. And I was visiting Ironbridge in Shropshire, somewhere where you wouldn't, it's not a 20th century place. You go there, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You go to see the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. And I don't know if anybody else, I found it very strange that you find these sites in a landscape which is so green and beautiful. There isn't a hint of the satanic there. It's very green. And I puzzled about this. It's a very odd place walking about. And I came across, I saw something called the Silkin Way. And I suddenly realised I should have known this before, being a historian of post-war Britain. But I realised because of that name that I was in a new town. And the reason that I was in this landscape that was so green was because this was also the landscape of Telford New Town. And now Telford New Town was one of a number of places. You know, the history of the new towns is told through dispersal, but they were often used, as at Peterlee, in places as a response to issues of dereliction. And the issue there in Telford was really quite extreme. They had something called the measles map, which showed, and it was extremely dangerous. I stayed in a hotel, and the person told me about they were digging in their garden, and suddenly the spade fell through because they hadn't worked out where these mines were, and the slag heaps were still there, still burning. It was sort of and so the first thing that they had to do, the Development Corporation, was just work out where all of this was. And there were huge worries about children. This line that came out in Moa of playing on the slag heaps, and it's a very bad thing. So this landscape that when I visited Ironbridge, was green and pastoral. In the 1950s, was really seen as a place that was, was lunar and revolting and scary and frightening. So I've got 2 points to make about Telford, I suppose, and one is the invisibility of this history, that it's not talked about, and I might turn that into a question about heritage and how we deal with these spaces. I mean, I think there's an irony in somewhere like Ironbridge, which has made a tourist attraction of this 19th century history, that the 20th century history has disappeared. I think of the recent demolition, lamented by me and maybe a few other people, of the beautiful Ironbridge B power station with its wonderful ochre colour to be like the sort of iron, the ferrous soil around there. So that's my first thing. And the second one I want to is just Telford New Town. They planted 5 million trees in this place. It was quite an extraordinary thing. But this has resulted in a landscape, because a lot of it remains dangerous. And I don't drive, it's not a place for a pedestrian, but you sort of suddenly come across these strange hills, and until I understood some of this history, it didn't make sense why there's, you get a little piece of these things, and it's exceptionally undense. It makes, earlier new towns like Harlow or Stevenage look like Rome or Paris. This is a very, very discombobulating place. But also, I think this is a thing in Telford to talk about some of the successes of this. And, Telford remains one of the highest growing places, as a lot of the Mark III new towns. And that's a theme of optimism that I want to sort of keep. And when I've been working, the other way I came to this subject was at the end of work I've done on the British Leisure Centre, a thing I'm sort of, one of the defenders of, and I came, that a lot of that people like Cliff Tandy and the landscape architects who are thinking about issues of derelict land have this huge, which I find very inspiring, optimism when they talk about it. One of the things that this is going to, that Michael Dower talks about, there's going to be this new age of leisure, and derelict land is one of the places, and these that they're going to be able to come into a new economy. I like very much Sylvia Crow's argument. The recently discovered then idea that the Norfolk Broads, this landscape at the centre of people's, of recreation, and was actually the result of medieval peat building, peat mining. So that actually the Norfolk Broads was a mining landscape, showed that with a bit of help, and you've got these huge batteries and machinery that you can use, that you could speed this up, and you could shift these from places the landscapes of crisis into landscapes of sort of hope and possibility. And now I suppose that optimism, one of the reasons I've been interested in this, and the time scale that Moa's stuff has, and the meta-narratives we say about the 1970s as a time of crisis. And I'd like to sort of push her to sort of place this within that story. And I suppose there are two ways that one could pitch this as an important discussion. And one of them is that these are, you're fighting for the periphery. These are forgotten places. This is a new history of, to use, the multiple cliches of left behind Britain or so on. But I'm wondering whether we can actually push this further to the centre of historiographical meta-narratives, and how this might fit in with a sort of a dynamic welfare state in the 1970s, someone like Carlson's arguments, or the meta-narrative of deindustrialization. And I'd just like so in my comments, those are the two things that I want to sort of discuss. And one last point. I don't know how long I've gone on for, but if I can make one more point. And I was thinking in this about the rapid changes, trying to link energy production with landscape and how our places look. And you end by saying that there are new environmental concerns which are going to profoundly change how cities look. And I just suddenly was thinking that I didn't know about this stage in between, actually, of that, of Britain becoming a net importer of coal, and where that does the spoil. What happens to does the spoil stay at source? Where is it coming through? And I wondered if you knew about that. So those are my three questions. And what a great paper! And I've got I've got my pieces coming out. It's about leisure in the Journal of British Studies, but they're hopeless. So don't submit there. It's been done for a while. But thank you. And now,
yeah, thank you so much, Otto. And it's really great to have your comments and kind of to think along with me and with all of us about these kind of histories. And I think it does raise a lot of questions. I mean, this kind of material can go in so many different directions, obviously. And you started with talking about the, places like Peterlee really kind of coming about as a response to that dereliction that particular area was facing. But then you also were talking about this kind of the invisibility, or the kind of, one might sometimes say that these kinds of projects kind of, sometimes, but not in all places, but it sort of erases something and it naturalizes something. And there are many people that have kind of written about this, but I think it's really important to remember that some of the early landscapes and landscape architects, you mentioned Sylvia Crowe, for example. I mean, the idea, for example, Sylvia Crowe did a landscape around the nuclear power station in Wales, in Snowdonia National Park, which I happen to also write about in my book. But that's a really interesting one because the national parks policy has just been minted. And then a few years later, the civil nuclear program gets started, and these two policies come in direct conflict with one another in this national park. And Sylvia Crowe gets hired to kind of help deal with that situation. And she doesn't try to naturalize the scheme. Like, the point isn't to make them blend in and, hide them or whatever. The point is to really use that opportunity to create a new kind of landscape that we hadn't had before. And she refers to it as a kind of cosmic landscape in her book, Landscape of Power. And I think a response to your question. I don't know what you think about that, but it was really an attempt to create something different. And I don't know. I think the way that these things have I mean, a lot of the landscapes that they created have become very naturalized to the degree that we sometimes try to protect them and designate them, for example, and it's difficult because people don't even know that they're there or that they were designed really carefully at some point. Is that, yeah.
She's such a hero, Sylvia Crow. And that book is absolutely, it's so lyrical and wonderful about the sort of possibilities of that.
Yeah, she really is. And someone like Lucius Cepeli-Knorr, who is at Liverpool University, is working a lot on the history of Crow, but also someone like Brenda Colvin, who you're probably familiar with also, and really kind of bringing the women's contribution to these histories to the fore and acknowledging them. There's a bigger question around how this fits into the kind of the wider narratives of the welfare state, and that's something that I also try to think about in my book. Of course, I mean, it's something that we all should think about working in this period. And one of the reasons that I'm really interested in these planning histories, and it does go into a lot of areas, you know, social and political history that's outside of, I think, my realm as a urban historian. You know, you quickly get it. For example, the Aberfan disaster is so rich and well researched, and there's been so much written on that already. But the way I see it, these kind of architects and planners that were working on these projects, they basically tried to change not just the landscape, but also the profession in which they operated in. So the land use consultants came in, started in 1966, or was it 65? Otto will correct me. And it was really a new kind of design and planning and engineering practice that could deal with these kinds of landscapes at that time. And I find that really interesting in itself. Was it that these kind of environments really called for and needed and required a new kind of design and planning practitioner that could handle the complexity of this project? I don't know if you have anything. You worked also on the land use consultants.
A bit, yes. I suddenly wanted to ask about the politics of the coal board. I mean, who are they and what do they think? What is their responsibility? Ideas of moral economy to. I mean, who are their constituents? Are they the minor? Are they the larger? And what are their politics? Are they technocrats or big union men, or who are they?
And again, there might be someone in the room that's. Yes, here we go.
Yes, well, I used to work for the National Coal Board, 78 to 83, I think, 82. So National Coal Board, just to answer, I mean, it's astonishing that I'm of an age where I can say this, but they're a nationalised industry. But back in the 60s, I mean, people, the miners, you know, the social context is worth thinking about. The miners, I mean, in 46, when everything was nationalised, they thought it's the best thing since sliced bread. Absolutely wonderful. They didn't have to fight for their jobs, fight for getting a sack whenever, you know, there was a downturn, there'd be, you know, the mine owners used to just close the mine. A huge problem. So it was fantastic in the 40s and 50s for the miners. Aberfan was a huge turning point. So I'm so pleased you've highlighted because it's so important. It was a huge shock for the National Coal Board because I'm sure you realise this and you don't have time to go into it, but they were responsible and they had all the information available to them, and there'd been earlier slips in South Wales, particularly problematic because of the nature of the valleys. Thank you so much for bringing all the memories back for me, actually, because it was a long time ago for me. But it's very interesting to see how the social side has developed. And the other thing I'd like to say as well that struck me was it's very interesting that you've highlighted the coal industry, but of course the mineral industry in the UK has carried on. And it's interesting to see how the UK deals with mining or mineral extraction today, and has developed since the 40s and 50s. So now when you get a planning consent for a quarry, the restoration is all sorted. There's triple SIs galore. You know, they don't even like restoration to agriculture anymore. You know, they want something really special. So things have moved on, and Aberfan, I think, has a big part to play in that. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing and for coming. That's brilliant. Yeah, I mean, it's a really the kind of the beast of the National Coal Board, of course, also changes with you know, changes in government. And I mean, a lot again has been written, for example, about when Thatcher comes in and the miners' strike and the kind of slow or fast demise of the coal industry. But again, I think these planners and landscape architects that I'm focusing on, they sit in that really unique situation between a very large, powerful national agency that is increasingly forced to kind of take responsibility because of the various acts, planning acts, etc., that are being passed. So I think pressure on them to deal with questions of aesthetics of the landscape, dereliction, etc., it's also kind of coming from above in a way, from these planning instruments. So that's something I'm really interested in, that because you very often, if you go to Kew and other places, you know, you see that they really often do the bare minimum, and they often do kind of the number crunching to figure out what they're going to do exactly. But not always. I mean, there's also schemes where they really cared about the landscape and about their role in these various communities, etc. And they had been active, of course, for a very long time in certain places. So it's not, I don't think we can kind of generalize across that responsibility. But the planners, they sit and they're hired by these really large industrialists at a time where there's a growing public discontent about the changing landscape and what the industrial projects in these various industries are creating across Great Britain. And they become kind of mediators between, I think, public interests and the interests of the state. And that they, of course, for example, Clifford Tandy, he serves the National Coal Board, and there was a lot of critique against his work, that he was trying to, you know, kind of greenwash and whitewash that disaster, and, you know, that it wasn't really good design work, etc. But I think he did have that optimism that you mentioned also. They were really, that's at least how I see it, that he understood that something had to be done and like someone had to do it. And he went into a job like that, trying to kind of do his best and do something new with that opportunity. Oh, sorry.
Thanks. I just wanted to pick up on that point about Tandy. And I'm really curious about the relationship with the picturesque that you mentioned, and about the creation of a natural or natural seeming landscape that's obviously such a tense relationship with the industrial aspect here. I'm wondering whether it's tied into the immense interest in the picturesque through the 30s and 40s, through the Architectural Review, that's obviously a very familiar history. And whether there is something to be said here about the slightly patrician aspects of the picturesque seeping into a history that we otherwise see as, in the interests of the working class. And just a separate point was that your incredibly vivid and detailed historical account made me think of where I was this weekend up on the northwest coast in Sellafield, further north at St Bees, where there were a colony of seabirds, kittiwakes and razorbills nesting on a quarried coastline. And I just think it's another interesting example of the natural world taking over an extracted material site.
Yeah, great. And thank you so much for kind of making that connection. I mean, the links to the picturesque are really explicit in this work. And someone like Clifford Tandy, who, I mean, he didn't study landscape architecture, for example. he came into the profession because of his active war service. He was working as a land surveyor during the war period, you know, drawing up, measuring, surveying, etc. And he acquired a lot of skills, terrain mapping and reconnaissance of different kinds, and especially skills for kind of surveying these kind of views and vistas across the landscape using tools that have been used in the military setting for, I mean, I guess millennia actually, but many centuries at least. And when he applied to become a member of the Landscape Institute, or ILA as it was called back then, because he didn't have any qualifications, what he submitted were these analysis reports of these picturesque landscape gardens. So he went to places like Stowe, etc., and kind of analyzed them from using these tools that he had learned to demonstrate that he understood them and he knew how to work with them. And I think there are many examples of where they really make explicit references to that period. Other landscape architects did as well. There was someone working for the Central Electricity Generating Board, Ronald Hebblewith, who developed also a set of tools for kind of dealing with landscapes of this enormous scale. You know, power stations are visible for such a great area around them. Like, how do you design such an area and, you know, create those views coming at them from the motorway and from nearby and far away and up the hill and like down by the lake. You know, there's like so much intricacy to these projects, some of them. And he studied the picturesque landscapes and the parks and the techniques that they would have employed, someone like Capability Brown and others. And I don't know, there are also moments where they sort of see themselves in that lineage, which is also kind of an interesting, I think, juxtaposition. And it does, of course, become political, just like the picturesque gardens were highly political. I mean, these industrial landscapes are also really political. I mean, I'd love to, maybe over drinks we can talk more about that, but it is really, I find that fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Moa. That was fascinating. I loved the videos in particular. Mine was more of a sort of perhaps like bureaucratic or institutional question, but I was struck by looking at when the National Archives AT marking I know very well, like the Department of the Environment, but I was wondering, as an environmental historian, how do you see the establishment of the Department of the Environment in this story? What happens there? Do you see? I mean, there's lots of talk about Aberfan as a turning point, but do you see that sort of institutional restructuring as significant, or maybe it's not? I was interested in that.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think maybe you know more about that than I do.
Well, I mean, I work on housing history, so it's quite because the MHLG then gets absorbed into the DOE. But this was interesting for suddenly making me step back and think, oh, there's a lot more that's going on in those offices at the same time.
Yeah, definitely, and that kind of hierarchy in terms of who makes the decisions and how different questions move up and down the ranks. I mean, that is, of course, super interesting. I don't really have anything specific to say about the Department of Environment and that formation. I mean, I'd love to know more about it. It does probably come into it. But I'm not sure at this point exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks so much. Thanks for that wonderful talk, and I learned a lot. I guess I was thinking, this maybe goes back more to the stashed rather than piled history, but of this kind of reuse of waste as an architectural material, and this is more a question out of ignorance than any particular aim in asking you this, which is how this fits into a history of the reuse of materials for architecture, and a kind of question of the value of architectural materials, because it seems like there's this you're telling this incredible history of the kind of devaluation and revaluation over and over and over again of the same material, right, which gets sort of, it's valued it's valued as something which produces value, then it's waste, and it's valuable again somehow, but then it's waste again. And it just made me think of how this does or doesn't fit into other sort of histories of the material reuse, where now its value, it has value only in this sort of particular and very specific context, rather than as some kind of precious or otherwise valuable matter.
Yeah, great. I love that question, and I haven't really thought about it as a history of reuse, but I do think that's a really interesting kind of angle, actually. And you're right that the whole, well, my kind of focus on colliery waste is really about that process of re-evaluating that substance and what it means in different contexts and to different actors, right? It doesn't mean the same to everyone. And even the same spoil heap in the same, of course, there's so many different viewpoints and feelings and positions about it. I don't really know, how it relates to reuse histories in the built environment. The more valuable it becomes, there's a history of kind of financial value versus, there's something about kind of financial values versus the value of the kind of emotional value of the dereliction. That I think that balance is really interesting to trace. I don't know, do you have any thoughts, Otto, on that kind of reuse angle? He's shaking his head. Do you have any thoughts on that yourself?
No, all I had was there was a bad pun about spolia and spoil.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
but
the
kind of things that get reused and put on the exterior versus the kind of spoil or waste, which then becomes a kind of substrate or ground.
Yes, and also, again, I mentioned just that they weren't treated as land; they were treating as these mobile assets from a legal point of view, and that the point was to move them. They weren't sort of meant to stay, but then there was no planning for where they would go or who would move them, or so I guess that could be another aspect of reuse, possibly. Yeah, but I'll think about that. Thank you.
Hi. I just wanted to say, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, and also to echo what this gentleman was saying about the significance of this history, especially with regards to Aberfan, and also thank you for bringing it into the present as well. I think it's really, important to have a space to think about how, the energy industry still impacts communities so significantly, and perhaps even kind of after coal in Britain, thinking about nuclear, and other even more renewable energies and how they might impact our landscape and the communities around them. My question was about the kind of sources that you used. The Coalboard film unit is absolutely fascinating, and I was wondering if you used any kind of oral histories or the kind of living memory of these landscapes as a bit of a counterpoint to that very idealized, almost propagandist vision that we have in those films.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think the films are really interesting, and that's something I'm sort of looking into a little bit now with this project I'm doing at the CCA in Montreal. But the National Coalboard Film Unit was active for so many decades, and they produced something like 1,000 films about the coal mining industry, and some of them were informational films, but a lot of them were also kind of promotional films, so they would be shown in cinemas before the main picture came on. Like you'd have a short film about coal mining and people playing rugby in front of this. So, and I think that kind of they hired also like the best filmmakers around. Like some of the biggest names from that industry were active at the Coalboard, and I just find that so interesting that public communication work was so prioritized, and it was so important to their activities, right? Even though, of course, they were a state or organ, they could, in some ways, they could go about their business. But yeah, it was such a strong PR angle to their work. The second part of your question was about
oral histories, and if you
histories, yes,
spoke to people who remembered these landscapes as they were then.
Yes, that is a really good question, and I've tried to form that's so during my PhD, you're right, I did look mostly at the kind of the planning side of thing and the people who paid for it and the people who drew them. And so for the book, I really kind of tried to incorporate more of the kind of the reception history of these sites and how they, which is harder, a lot harder, I think, for all of us. Like we know like how people receive this work is not as covered. Like I've looked a lot, for example, at the British newspaper archive, and both for the coal industry and for the electricity industry and for the oil industry, there's a fantastic oral history project at the British Library. And that's, of course, not exclusive, but it does include a lot of accounts by local residents as well as the more kind of powerful actors in this story. So I've spent a lot of work there. It's something that I kind of always wish I had more on. So for example, the chapter I have on the nuclear power station in Wales, that chapter is a lot about the resistance to it. And the resistance to the nuclear power stations came from London. It didn't come from Wales, right? In Wales, they wanted a nuclear power station. And they wanted it in the middle of the national park because the coal industry was like dying, the jobs had gone, the nuclear industry promised like a new kind of rebirth of energy for Wales that they needed so desperately. And then we have people like Claude Williams Ellis, who wrote England and the Octopus and others, who has Port Meiron, just like a few 20 minutes drive from where the power station is. And he's also the chairman of the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England at the time. And he's very careful threading that line. He's like sort of both a local resident, but he's also then part of this conservation agency in London. So I don't know, the history of that is just so fascinating. And I think having more kind of on-the-ground accounts always helps us to tell and understand these histories. So I think it's a kind of constant struggle. But yeah, I've used a lot of newspapers. The projects are quite recent. I've been to Orkney, I've been to the oil terminal and Flotta there, and there are still people around who were, because that played out in the early 70s, so it's a very recent history. But it's not like a substantial part of my toolkit, I would say. But I do find it really interesting, yeah.
Thank you. It's really,
Thanks.
really helpful. Thanks.
Just to say huge thanks for the talk, which I thought was brilliant. I have questions of my own, but I think we're running out of time, so I have a couple of questions from the audience. There's three of them, and I think I'll just ask them one after the other, and then maybe you can answer them together. So the first one is quite specific. It's about the film about Aberfan, which included text in Spanish. Why? Was it aimed towards Latin American specialists? Could you please name who made the film and what it was called? And the second one, you've talked a little bit about this already when you started, but it's around, well, Germany and others in Europe have retained the idea of landscapes of leisure, for instance, retaining redundant steelworks as parks instead of demolishing and treating the site as real estate. How can the UK get back to treating ex-industrial sites as new places of leisure and culture? I guess this is to both Moa and Otto. And then the last one is about dereliction, and it's asking, or saying that it's interesting because it's about responsibility rather than impact. Do you see a range of terms that relate to this, or is it consistent? I'm not sure if fully.
Oh, yeah.
But I'll just read it out in entirety. Can I ask about the term dereliction? I've been looking at it in another context, and it's interesting because it is about responsibility rather than impact. Do you see a range of terms that relate to this, or is it consistent? But maybe we can go with the first two, and then we can, if we have time to think about dereliction.
Sure, yeah, sure. And I think I'm going to hand the second one to you. You can think about that. Yeah, the film on Aberfan, that's also in Spanish. It's English and Spanish. It's there to signify that the films, again, you were talking about the film unit, they become really, there's such an interest in these films, these promotional films and the activities. And they do get distributed abroad. And that film is produced in Spanish because it was distributed in Spanish-speaking contexts because there was so much interest in their output. So that's, I mean, it's super interesting. Whoever asked that question, it's a great question. If you send me an email, I can send you the full details on that film. I can't remember it on the top of my head. But yeah, it's a really fascinating, history with those films, and just thinking about how the interest was so far-flung, you know, that it wasn't just kind of in the local context or across the workforce that would view these films. I mean, I'll just say something very briefly about the last question, and then maybe, Otto, we can talk about the kind of current leisure spaces. The term dereliction is kind of like a buzzword, I guess, in some ways at the moment. And maybe I should really, when I talk about Wales, I should really think of it as like lived dereliction. Because these are they're not like forgotten landscapes somewhere else, you know, that someone has abandoned. They're lived in. Most of these valleys are populated, and, you know, and that's what really interests me, that people live amidst the dereliction. And the dereliction, like we said before, has changed and it's become green, etc. But it's really how kind of life has transpassed amidst that dereliction that I find interesting. Did you want to? Sorry, I'm just putting you on the spot.
Just to thank whoever online said that question about, you know, and compared to Germany. And I've just thought about recently being in Redcar and the steelworks there, and which was one of them, I just think is one of the most extraordinary landscapes. You walk along the South Car and then you see this thing on the distance, and it's like Venice with all these sort of from the lagoon, and it's gone. And, you know, and even the bit that we did manage to get listed there, in that area, has also been demolished, and it's such a so different from that wonderful landscape in the Ruhr, which has been much more successfully, and I'm very sad about it. So thank you to whoever asked that question. And I just thought that, I mean, you know, about the sort of longer histories of, I found Vittorio De Palma's book about wasteland really useful, and I think, you know, something's going on with that idea of dereliction, which is actually dealing with, you know, we talked about the 18th century history, but there's a religious connotation here, and a 17th century language.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of us teach in architecture schools, like I teach it in architecture school, and I think there's also something in these histories for the kind of practitioner, the designer, in terms of the boldness of some of these schemes, right? They were really thinking about like big, bold ideas that, I mean, yes, they weren't immediately value engineered out, but they were, you know, there was something about that optimism and that kind of the aspiration of some of these projects that I think we can really learn from.
Can I just add something really quickly about the question about steelworks? My favourite kind of reimagining of an abandoned steelworks is the Magna Centre in just outside Sheffield, which is in the old Templeborough Steelworks. And I don't know if many people have heard of it, but I spent hours there as a child in absolute wonder. I mean, it's a kind of science museum, but it's also a terrifying chasm of darkness and fire. You know, it's to be a young child there, kind of after the industrial era, is really affecting, and I really recommend it, you know, to anyone who's interested in, you know, old steelworks and the remnants of industry.
Great, thank you. And I just want to say thank you everyone for coming and for your great questions. And we can continue, I guess, over a drink.
Yes, I think we need to draw it to a close. Thank you so much, Moa, for a wonderful talk, and thank you, Otto, for the response and for the discussion in general. Thank you, everyone, for being here, also online. I hope you will all come next week as well for David Gisson's talk, which is on the architecture of disability, which is also very exciting. And I would like to invite everyone here for a drink next door. Thank you.